You have been shown a beautiful facade your entire life. What has been portrayed for centuries as places of spiritual solitude and prayer crumbles to pieces upon the first contact with real facts. Descend 20 meters below ground level and the illusion vanishes. Beneath the foundations of Europe's largest monasteries lies another architecture: engineering, logistics, and military. Tunnels as tall as a 10-story building, fleets of 36 naval vessels, hydraulic systems that outpace London's sewer system by 500 years. These are not places for humble hermits. They are industrial complexes and key control points over entire continents. Why does official history explain this engineering triumph with the simple word gradually? Why would a modest monastery need a chemical laboratory under the personal control of the King of Spain? How did monks in Arctic latitudes hold a monopoly on the survival of the entire region and withstand an 8-year siege by a regular army? And who benefited from draping this strategic network in a religious veil? The main question is, who really designed this global infrastructure that continues to function impeccably to this day? Imagine, you enter a monastery, a quiet courtyard, the scent of stone, narrow windows, monks in robes, prayers at dawn, a modest meal. Everything is just as you imagined. Everything is exactly as it's portrayed in textbooks and travel brochures. And now descend 20 meters below ground level and see what is there. Because that's where the real history is. Beneath the foundations of the largest monasteries in Europe lies another architecture. Not for prayer, not for contemplation, but for engineering, logistics, and military purposes. Tunnels that officially led nowhere, yet sustained the flows of gold, salt, wine, and strategic reserves for centuries. Storage facilities that housed not relics, but resources from entire regions. Fortresses that were built not for seclusion, but for those who controlled the territory within a 100-kilometer radius. I will explore 7 locations, from an underground vault in Kiev to an Arctic factory on the White Sea, from a chemical laboratory of the Spanish kings to tunnels in Bavaria, which still lack explanation. Each site is not an anomaly. It is an element of a system. There is a question that needs to be kept in mind throughout the conversation. It sounds simple. If a monastery is a place of prayer, why does it have underground chambers the size of a factory? Why does it have a fleet of 36 ships? Why does it have a chemical laboratory under the king's personal control? And why build tunnels in which not a single trace of a person has been found after 800 years? The answer to this question is not found in official tour routes. It lies underground. Before moving on to the 7 main topics, here's an example to set the scale of the discussion. When historians describe monastic construction, they typically use one word: gradually. The monastery grew gradually. It gradually accumulated land. It gradually developed its economy. This convenient word alleviates the question of where the complex engineering knowledge came from among those who were officially engaged in prayer. But gradually does not explain the following. The hydraulic systems of several hundred monasteries across Europe were built according to the same principle. Sanitary engineering in German abbeys is ahead of urban systems by 4 to 5 centuries. The acoustic properties of monastery halls are precisely calculated, not accidental. Crypts and underground chambers are located in strategically advantageous points of the terrain. Is all this gradually? Gradualness is an explanation of the process, not an explanation of the result. Here is a specific question that arises from this. In the 12th century, a Cistercian monk who has just arrived from the Mother Abbey in Burgundy to establish a new one in Bavaria or Poland, how does he know that the water needs to be directed this way and not that way? Where does he get his understanding of the hydrology of the local landscape, without maps, without surveying tools, without years of observing floods? Why 50 years later does this monastery operate like a finely tuned hydraulic machine rather than like a flooded ruin? The answer that history offers is experience and faith. This is not an answer. It is an evasion of the answer. Experience is transmitted through learning. Faith does not lay down drainage ditches. Someone specifically passed on specific technical knowledge, and that knowledge worked. In western Bohemia, in the town of Plassy, stands a 12th century Cistercian monastery. Officially, it is yet another abbey, a place of prayer and study. It looks like any other Baroque monastery of the 18th century. A solemn facade, white walls, domes. On the foundation of this monastery, there is an inscription, in Latin. It translates literally as, "This building will collapse without water." Not may collapse, will collapse. Check this. Look at the building and try to understand. How can a monastery physically depend on water? After all, water destroys foundations. Anyone who has dealt with construction knows this. Moisture is the enemy of structures. Why does a monastery need water under its foundation? Answer. Under the monastery, 5,100 oak piles are driven in. They go into the marshy ground and have been standing in water for several centuries. Oak, in an anaerobic environment, that is, without access to oxygen, fully submerged in water, does not rot. Instead, it mineralizes. It gets infused with minerals, gradually turning into a material as strong as stone. But only as long as it remains submerged in water. If the water level drops, oxygen will reach the wood, decay will begin, and the structure will sink into the ground in a few years. Therefore, the monastery caretakers are required to check the water level in the special mirror pools 4 times a day, every day, for several centuries. 4 times a day, every day, for hundreds of years. This is not a decoration or a legend. It is an engineering fact, etched in stone. Now put yourself in the position of a designer. You are building a structure on marshy ground. You know that a conventional foundation is impossible here. You make the decision to drive in several thousand piles, maintain water levels in special pools, and organize daily monitoring. This means you are designing not just a building. You are designing a system of ongoing maintenance that will function for centuries. You are incorporating into the project the obligation of all future caretakers. It's not about building it once, but about maintaining it endlessly. Such a project requires an understanding that the building will last a very long time, that it will be used by generations, that it is worth the investment. This is not thinking 20 years ahead. This is thinking centuries ahead. And beneath the same monastery lies a system of air tunnels stretching for several hundred meters. In the summer, they accumulate the heat of the earth. In the winter, warm air rises through vents under the windows of the first floor. A pre-industrial climate control system, established in the 18th century, 100 years before central heating was introduced into homes. Who knew how to design this? Where did this knowledge come from? This is one object, one of many that I have studied, and it's not even the strangest of them. Let's start with money, with very specific money. In 1898, workers were conducting scheduled repairs in one of the churches of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. Something went wrong. A tool struck the wall, and a hidden chamber was revealed. Imagine this moment. An ordinary repairman, a hammer, plaster crumbling, and in the crack, metal glimmers. He approaches closer, widening the breach. Inside, tightly packed rows. Gold, silver, vessels. He likely runs to fetch the elder. The elder rushes to the abbot. They count 6,184 gold coins and almost 10,000 silver ones. The total weight, about 300 kilograms. Not in a bank, not in a princely treasury, in the wall of a monastery. 300 kilograms of precious metals. By chance. This is what they found. Now the question is, how much more has not been found? The Kiev-Pechersk Lavra was founded in 1051. The near and far caves extend beneath Kiev to a depth of 5 to 20 meters. The official version is simple. This place is a monastic retreat and a necropolis for saints. Tourists are shown relics in glass tombs, burning candles, golden frames of icons, and narrow passages with low vaults. A complete package of sacredness. The guide talks about the exploits of the monks, their asceticism, and the incorrupt relics. But there is one text that is not mentioned in tourist itineraries. The Pterikon of the 15th century is a collection of stories about the monks of the Lavra. It is based on earlier sources and contains documentary accounts of specific people in specific circumstances. There is a tale about a monk named Theodore. He found an endless multitude of gold, silver, and precious vessels in the so-called Varangian cave. This is a direct quote from a medieval source. Not a legend concocted later, not a folk tradition, a documented text with specific names, dates, and circumstances. Theodore hid the treasures so reliably that when Prince Mstislav began to torture him, demanding to reveal their location, Theodore said nothing. The location has not been found to this day. Stop for a moment. A medieval monk hid the location of gold in the monastery caves from torture. This is not a story of holiness. It is a story about the fact that there was something to hide in those caves. And someone knew this and wanted to know more. Why caves? Why not a city wall, a noble's courtyard, or a fortified castle? Technical response. The caves provided what no terrestrial object of that time could offer: a constant temperature, protection from fires, access only for the initiated, and the ability to seal entrances so that they were simply invisible from the outside. In the conditions of endless raids, sieges, and palace coups, this was the only reliable safe. City walls burned, fortresses fell, monastic dungeons remained. Laser 3D scanning conducted from 2005 to 2019 revealed that the Lavra cave system is a dynamic structure, with unregistered cavities, with tunnels that are not present on any official map. Research from 1978 uncovered hidden trap sites, locules, and crypts, the existence of which was not officially known. Officially. Stop at this word. In a cave system that is nearly 1,000 years old and has been a site of pilgrimage and tourist visits for centuries, there are spaces unknown to researchers. The Soviet archivists who worked there for decades did not know them. Nor did the monks of previous generations, or perhaps they knew but did not pass on the knowledge to those who followed. The caves of the Lavra are not natural karst formations. They are tunnels carved by humans. Tunnels that someone deliberately built and did not map. Or were mapped, but the map wasn't handed down to the next custodians. Or it was intentionally destroyed. 3 possibilities. None of them make the situation any less intriguing. Now, something important. Why did the Soviet power turn the caves into an anti-religious museum? Officially, it was to expose the deception of the faithful through an exhibition of relics. The logic is clear. But pay attention to what was not mentioned in this museum. There was not a word about the economic function of the Lavra. Not a word about the fact that it was the largest treasure repository in the territory of Rus. Not a word about the hiding places, treasures, archives, or the 300 kilograms found during renovations. The emphasis was on the relics. Silence about money. This is a choice in itself. To tell one thing and to remain silent about another. It is important to understand that this silence took effort. Soviet researchers of the Lavra were professional archivists. They worked with documents. They were aware of the treasure from 1898. They read the Pterikon. They conducted surveys of the caves. And yet, there is no section on financial functions of the monastery or system of hiding places in any official Soviet publication about the Lavra. This is not a missed detail. It is a systematic silence. The caves of the Lavra have served for several centuries as the safest place for storing not only relics, but also gold, documents, and archives. The monastery was positioned at a point through which trade routes, diplomatic missions, and military expeditions passed. Whoever controlled the Lavra had access to the information and resources it accumulated. This is not theology. This is geopolitics. And here's a question that official history sees no need to ask. If 300 kilograms were accidentally found in one cache, and the Varangian cave with its countless amounts of gold has yet to be discovered, what else might be there? And who knows about it? There is another aspect that deserves separate consideration. The Lavra is not just a repository. It was a center of attraction for pilgrims, merchants, diplomats, and military for several centuries. Everyone who passed through Kiev went through the Lavra. They brought donations. They left valuables for safekeeping. They sought blessings for trade deals. They confessed before military campaigns. The monastery, located at a pivotal point through which all major flows pass, is a monastery that possesses information about everything happening in the region. The resources that converge there are not just money. They also include debts, obligations, and secrets. In the Middle Ages, the monastery wall was not just a physical barrier, it was a boundary of jurisdiction. What happened inside was under church authority, not secular. This meant that bailiffs could not enter without permission. Documents were kept in archives, accessible only to the insiders. Transactions could be made without witnesses from the outside. This is the perfect infrastructure for storing not only gold, but also information that is worth more than gold. What exactly was stored in the monastery archives? Debt acknowledgments, wills, deeds of gift, documents of land transactions, confessional records, albeit indirectly, through information about sins, property, intentions. Everything that people brought to the monastery with a request to preserve, witness, seal with a stamp. The monastery archive was a system for accounting the obligations and debts of the entire region. Those who read these archives knew who owed whom, who gifted what, who was sinful before whom, who was waiting for an inheritance, and who was embroiled in a lawsuit. This was the intelligence map of the region, continuously updated in real time by everyone who came seeking a candle and a word of comfort. The Lavra as an intelligence and financial hub is not conspiracy theory. It is simply a logical consequence of what we know about its geographical position, the flows of people and resources that passed through it, and the nature of the authority the monastery exerted over these flows. But the Lavra is a repository in the city. What happens when a monastery is built not in the city, but on an Arctic archipelago in the White Sea, and begins to behave like an autonomous state? Solovetsky Islands, White Sea. In winter, ice, wind, darkness for 18 hours a day. Any construction here requires 3 times more resources than on the mainland. Any logistics, 3 times more complicated. Any error in engineering is fatal. The monastery was founded in the year 1436 by 2 monks from the Kirillo-Belozersky monastery. The official history begins with asceticism. They arrived in a harsh place and built a community through labor and prayer. This is true, but this is just the beginning of the story. There is one question that official history does not ask. Why here? Why did the monks, who were seeking solitude, choose the archipelago in the White Sea? For seclusion in the 15th century, any forest within 200 versts of Moscow would have sufficed. There were plenty of forests. There was no shortage of deserted places. Yet they traveled several thousand versts north, took to their boats, and settled on an island in the White Sea. The answer in logistics. The islands in the White Sea are a crossroads of maritime routes. Norway, Sweden, Pomor merchants, Scandinavian fishermen, expeditions to the east. All of them somehow bypassed the Solovetsky archipelago or passed by. A monastery located at such a crossroads is a nodal point through which information, goods, and people flow. Not a quiet place for prayer, a strategic position. By the 1660s, the monastery owned 54 saltworks. This is not a trade, this is a monopoly. This is what the saltworks looked like from the inside. A huge wooden box over a dug well. The brine rises from the bottom, already salty, from depths of several meters. Under the box, there's a constant fire. The water evaporates, and salt settles on the walls. It is collected with shovels, dried, and packaged into bags. 54 such installations operated simultaneously, day and night, 8 months a year, as long as the weather permitted. This is not monastic life. This is industrial production. The entire north bought salt from the monastery because there was no alternative. Plus, the fleet, 36 large maritime vessels and hundreds of small boats. For comparison, many European states at that time had fewer trading ships. Additionally, there was a blacksmithing and ironworking complex. Plus, the island had 52 lakes connected by canals built by the monks into a single hydraulic system. Fresh water flowed by gravity directly into the monastery, powering the mills. Remember this number, 52 lakes. This is not just a random natural resource. It is an engineering project to connect 100 bodies of water into a managed system. In climatic conditions where the ground freezes several meters deep. In an era when there were no mechanical excavators, only human hands, shovels, and wooden tools. Someone designed this system. It wasn't built haphazardly. It was designed with an understanding of slopes, water flow, and control points. This knowledge doesn't come out of thin air. Historians typically say, the monastery developed gradually, naturally. Its economic activity is the result of 200 years of accumulated experience. Okay, then answer one question. Why does a monastery, officially living in poverty and prayer, need a fleet of 36 large sea vessels? These are not fishing boats. This is transportation infrastructure for carrying large volumes of commercial cargo. Salt, iron, goods. This is a trading company in a monastic form. And one more fact that is important to understand. Salt in the pre-industrial era was not just a seasoning. It was the only available preservative. Without salt, it was impossible to keep meat through the winter. Fish could not be salted for future use. Hides could not be preserved. Salt determined how long an army could operate in the field, how long a ship could stay at sea, how long a city could withstand a siege without supplies. He who controlled salt in northern Russia controlled survival. This is not a metaphor. It is literal. The Solovetsky Monastery held a monopoly on salt in one of the country's most isolated and strategically important regions. 54 salt works. This is an industrial scale, incompatible with the image of a modest cloister. This is a nation-forming function packaged in a religious form. If it were a secular entity, we would call it a military-industrial complex with a merchant fleet. The monastic garb only changes the word. Here's what else is important to understand about the salt monopoly. Salt in medieval Russia is not just money. It is the key to the survival of the entire region. Without salt, there is no preservation. Without preservation, there are no winter supplies. Without supplies, the first poor harvest becomes famine, not just a difficulty. Whoever controls the salt controls the vulnerability of the entire population of the north. The Solovetsky Monastery had been the only entity for centuries that could halt or resume the supply of this resource at any moment. It wielded a power that required neither an army nor orders. Just cease the operations of the potteries, and within a few months, no one would negotiate the terms. Now look at one specific thing, the Boulder Dam. Its length is 1.5 kilometers. The width is 6.5 meters. The material consists of huge glacial boulders laid without mortar in dry masonry. It connects Big Solovetsky Island with Big Muksalma. Official explanation? The monks needed to drive the cattle to distant pastures. Okay, calculate the volume of work. 1.5 kilometers of stone embankment, 6.5 meters wide, in the conditions of the Arctic. 1 running meter of such an embankment is tens of tons of laid stone. 1.5 kilometers is thousands of tons. Each boulder needs to be found, dragged, and laid carefully, considering the weight of the neighboring stones. Without mortar. This means that the balance must be perfect, otherwise the sea will dismantle it at the first storm. How many people does this involve, And how many years? In the Arctic climate? For relocating livestock? This doesn't add up. But the key point is not the dam. The key point is what happened next. In the year 1668, the government forces of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich began the siege of the Solovetsky Monastery. They stood under its walls for 8 years. 8. A regular army with cannons against a monastery. A fortress with boulder walls 7 meters thick, its own fleet, supplies of salt and iron for years ahead, independent fresh water from a lake system that could not be poisoned or cut off from the outside. It proved to be impregnable. It was not taken by storm. It was taken through betrayal. One man, named Feoktist, revealed where a small window was sealed in one of the towers, opening into the dungeon. By breaching this single weak point, the guards entered inside. 8 years. The state army against the monastery. Name another monastery in history that was besieged by professional troops for 8 years, where it was not a coincidence of terrain, but rather a result of engineering superiority. And one more thing that is usually mentioned only in passing. The monastery officially served as a state prison from the 16th to the 20th century. Continuously. Prisoners were kept in niches within the fortress walls, stone sacks where a person could not stand upright. Political opponents, religious dissidents, inconvenient people. The spiritual center of the North, with a prison inside the walls. Simultaneously. Look at the list of prisoners. This place was not for criminals. It was for people who could not be tried publicly. Too much knowledge, too many sightings, too dangerous for exposure. Former favorites. Monks who disagreed with the Niconian reform. People who needed to be removed from sight. Quietly, without trial, without sentence. The Arctic walls by the White Sea reliably concealed what was inconvenient to explain. Solovki is a fortress, a factory, a fleet, a trade monopoly, and a place of isolation for state enemies. All at once, in one complex. The only thing that does not hold a central place in this description is prayer. And here's something else worth saying about the Solovetsky Islands. After the monastery was abolished in the 20th century and transformed into a Soviet special purpose camp, Sloan, no one built new infrastructure from scratch here. Soviet administrators used what was already in place: walls, warehouses, roads, canals, and mills. Everything that the monks had built for their economic needs turned out to be useful for the needs of the camp administration. The monastery is gone. The infrastructure remained and began to work for new owners. This is the same pattern that we will see over and over again. An object, initially established as a monastery, proves to be so functionally perfect that subsequent generations, with different goals and values, find it entirely usable. But Lavra and Solovki represent control over territory through resources and power. The next level is different. These are the monasteries that controlled the very energy, water, heat, movement, an engineering power over the landscape, invisible from the road and destructive to competitors. Mollbrunn, Baden-Württemberg, Germany. UNESCO calls it the most complete medieval monastery complex north of the Alps. tourists are shown the Gothic vaults, antique furniture, and the beautiful fountain house, an elegant pavilion with a wash basin in the center of the monastery cloister. This is referred to as a detail of monastic life. No one claims that this sink is the pinnacle of a system of 20 artificial lakes. Here's how it looked in action. The monk wakes up before dawn. He goes to wash at the fountain house, an elegant pavilion in the center of the cloister. Water flows on its own, without pumps, without buckets. Then he heads to the kitchen. There too, water flows, into troughs for livestock, into boiling pots. After breakfast, water carries away waste beyond the monastery walls. The entire process happens without a single person hauling water in buckets, without a single interruption due to drought or frost. 20 artificial lakes work for it around the clock. The Cistercians of Mulbrum have altered the courses of the Zalsack and Blaubach rivers. They redirected them, right through the monastery grounds. Inside the protected perimeter, the water powered the mill wheels and hammers. The source of energy lies behind the monastery wall. Invulnerable to siege, free of charge, operates around the clock, never tires. It is the 12th century. There are no other sources of mechanical energy. No steam, no electricity, no internal combustion engines. There are only draft animals, human hands, and water. Whoever has controlled water in the right place, their production thrives. Whoever does not, must do everything by hand. But that's not all the monks of Molsbrum did with water. Look at the so-called Deep Lake, Tiefersee, a huge artificial reservoir. At the same time, it's a buffer for dry seasons and an industrial fish farm. During Lent, the monks did not eat meat. Fish was their source of protein. But breeding fish in rivers is impossible due to floods, poaching, and variable water flow. However, in a managed lake with a regulated water level, it is achievable. This creates a production of protein food in predictable volumes. In total, the mills within the perimeter, sewage, pond aquaculture, drainage of swamps for arable land, all from one system of 20 artificial lakes. A beautiful wash basin in the cloister is a decorative detail atop an industrial complex. The Cistercians chose swamps and lowlands. Officially, for the sake of asceticism, for the difficult terrain, for spiritual humility through physical labor. This is a beautiful explanation. It appears in every guidebook. At first glance, it seems that asceticism is paramount. But look at the outcome. Every time the Cistercians chose a swamp, they gained a source of water under the control of the monastery, the ability to raise its level through dams, the possibility of channeling it where energy was needed, and a drainage system that transformed a useless swamp into arable land. This is not asceticism. It is a systematic strategy for seizing hydraulic resources under the guise of religious modesty. And it has been repeated in Germany, France, England, Austria, in different climate zones, in different centuries, with one handwriting. It feels too much like coincidence. And now for what is usually not included in tourist brochures. The internal canals of Mulbron constantly flushed the kitchens and toilets, carrying waste outside the monastery complex. An automatic sewage system from the 12th century. At that time, most European cities had no sanitation system whatsoever. People lived literally in their own waste. Epidemics wiped out entire neighborhoods. Medieval towns were on average several times less healthy in terms of infection rates than monasteries. The monks of Moulbron did not suffer from illnesses like the townspeople did. They established a sanitation system 5 centuries before it became the standard for cities in Europe. This is not a matter of luck. Someone understood very well how underground hydraulics work, how to create a constant pressure, and how to correctly calculate the slope of drainage ditches to prevent them from getting clogged. This is an engineering school. It existed, and it was concentrated in monasteries. There is a comparison that explains a lot. In 1665, 500 years after Moulbron, the Great Plague of London claimed nearly 100,000 lives. One of the main reasons, there was no sanitation. Waste flowed directly into the Thames, from which drinking water was drawn. This is London in the 17th century, one of the largest cities in the world. In the 12th century, the Cistercians of Moulbron had already solved this problem, for themselves, quietly, without publications, behind the monastery walls. How they knew this is a question that history prefers not to answer. And lastly, about Moulbron, which explains the economic scale of it all, an extensive network of drainage ditches dried up the marshes surrounding the monastery. The marshes were turned into arable land. The monastery became the largest landowner in the region, not through war, not through purchase, but through land reclamation. They arrived at the marsh, they drained it, they obtained a field. They recorded it as property. Quiet expansion, without blood, without contracts, a shovel and a ditch instead of a sword. The Cistercians acted in the same way throughout Europe. It is enough to look at the map of Cistercian abbeys and overlay it on the map of swamps that were drained in the 12th to 14th centuries. The coincidence is striking, too synchronous for coincidence. Look at the timeline. The Cistercian order was founded in 1098 in Burgundy. Over the next 150 years, it spread across Europe. More than 300 abbeys. Each was built according to the same principle: lowland, water, dam, canals. From Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, in one handwriting. These are not independent decisions made by individual monks, each of whom coincidentally arrived at the same conclusion. This is the dissemination of technology through the order's network. From the mother abbey to the daughter abbeys, from the daughter abbeys to their own daughters. Engineering knowledge about hydraulics, drainage, and sanitation was transmitted along with the rule of the order, along with prayer practices, and along with architectural plans. The order was an institution of knowledge transmission. The sacred format was its shell. There is one fact that illustrates this well. When founding a new Cistercian abbey, a group of 12 monks led by an abbot was always sent, a precise replica of the apostolic formula. Officially, this is evangelical symbolism. But look at the composition of the group. There was always someone skilled in surveying the terrain for water flow, someone knowledgeable about building dams, someone who understood drainage. They traveled under a religious guise and carried with them a technological package. Each new abbey was an unfolding of the same engineering knowledge in a new territory. Hydraulics is power over energy. But there is another kind of power, which is even more precious. Power over knowledge, over formulas, over concentrates, over what was then called the secrets of nature, and what we today refer to as chemistry and pharmacology. El Escorial, Spain. It was built over 21 years, from 1563 to 1584, under the direct supervision of Philip II. At the same time, it served as a royal residence, a monastery of Hieronymites, a burial place for Spanish kings, and the largest library of its time, all contained within a rectangular structure of gray granite, measuring 207 by 161 meters. Tourists are shown the tombs of kings, frescoes, and paintings by Titian. A grand mausoleum, a symbol of imperial power. No one takes tourists to the underground pharmacy. Imagine what it looked like. A narrow passage beneath the main building. A low arch, gray granite, the scent of wax and dried herbs. At the end, wooden shelves from floor to ceiling, each tightly filled with closed vessels, each vessel labeled in Latin. In front of the wall, a monk in a robe records in a book the date, the quantity, the condition of the concentrate. Above him, grand halls where courtiers await an audience with Philip II. None of them knows what lies 2 floors below. Beneath the Escorial lay the Botica, a pharmacy divided into 3 functional zones. Vast warehouses for raw materials, a laboratory, the Robotica, and 6 rooms in the basement where syrups, essences, and chemical concentrates were prepared. All of this was connected by underground passages to the hospital and the medicinal herb gardens specially laid out beyond the monastery walls. This is not a monastery garden with daisies. This is a production chain. Raw materials, processing, storage, delivery. It is designed, with spaces divided for different tasks. On the top floor of the pharmacy building stood the Mattioli furnace, the so-called Philosopher's Tower, Torre Filosofal, a unique distillation device. It was personally ordered by Philip II. The King of Spain, master of half the world, personally oversaw the construction of the distillation apparatus in the monastery's cellar. Not an architect, not the chief monk, the king. Ask yourself, why should a monarch personally concern themselves with the design of the oven in the monastery's pharmacy? Because distillation in the 16th century is not a pharmacy in the modern sense. It is the skill of extracting active substances from plants with predictable and concentrated effects. In small doses, it heals. In the right combination, it alters perception. This knowledge is valuable in itself, and no one wanted to share it with competitors. Officially, the Hieronymites are a contemplative order, people of prayer and solitude. Yet it was to them that Philip II entrusted the management of the largest scientific and production complex of the Spanish Empire. Not to the professors of the University of Salamanca, not to the court physicians, but to the monks. Monastic form as an institutional cover for a state laboratory. Now the main point, the Gallery of the Recovering, a passage between the pharmacy and the hospital, was constructed through a system of tunnels designed so that the flows of patients and medications would not intersect with the royal routes through the monastery. This is the project documentation. Architect Juan de Herrera planned for the separation of flows. Similar to a modern institution where one should not see the other, or where what is done in one place should not become known in another. Such architecture does not emerge from considerations of beauty. Here's how it worked. The patient arrives at the hospital. The attending monk requests the medication. The medication travels through a tunnel from the pharmacy, not through the monastery courtyard, not past the library, not where other monks walk, through an isolated underground passage. Who receives what is known only to those who are supposed to know. This is not paranoia. It's information security, which is today referred to as access control. And one more point that is often overlooked. The Escorial pharmacy was not only for the internal needs of the monastery, it was used by the Spanish court. Concentrates and compounds from Escorial were sent to royal residences, the navy, and the military. It was essentially a state pharmaceutical production, without a sign, without public status, under the cover of monastic life. When someone close to the king was dying, recovering, or falling out of favor after an illness, the provenance of their treatment often led here, to the monasteries underground, to the monks of the contemplative order. Now take a look at the scale of production. In 6 basement rooms of the Escorial pharmacy, concentrates from several dozen plants could be prepared simultaneously. Some of these plants grew in special gardens beyond the monastery walls. Samples from Castile to the American colonies were brought in for studying their properties. The Escorial was, in a way, the first systematic botanical and pharmacological archive of the Spanish Empire. This knowledge was not public. It was not taught in universities. It accumulated here, under the guidance of individuals bound by the monastic secret of confession and the monastery's discipline of silence. Now, a specific example to understand what exactly was produced here. In the gardens of El Escorial by 1580, more than 100 species of plants were being cultivated, including samples brought from the New World: cinchona, vanilla, tobacco, cacao. All of this was not a commercial commodity at that time, but rather a subject of research. The monks recorded properties, concentrations, and methods of storage. The records were kept in library archives that were closed to outsiders. The Spanish crown possessed information about the pharmacological properties of American plants earlier than anyone else in Europe, and this information remained within the walls of El Escorial, rather than leaking to competitors. How much did it cost, in the literal sense? Venetian merchants paid exorbitant amounts for access to descriptions of the properties of spices and plants. Information on how to concentrate the active substance of quinine was not mere botanical curiosity. It was a monopoly on the treatment of malaria. In the 16th century, when armies in the tropics were decimated by disease, such a monopoly was a strategic asset comparable to a military fleet. The underground collectors of Escorial protected the library from moisture through a system of natural ventilation, the same one that the Romans used in their underfloor heating systems. The principle is the same. The temperature difference between the underground and above-ground levels creates a constant movement of air. Someone in the 16th century knew this principle well enough to apply it in the design, 300 years before thermodynamics received a scientific description. This is a research institute, packaged in the form of monastic service, funded by the state under royal oversight and with divided information streams within. Now let's talk about scale. Because everything we've looked at so far are objects that can fit into familiar logic, albeit awkwardly. A pharmacy in a monastery, that's acceptable. Canals in a monastery, that's also acceptable. Gold in a hideaway, that's understandable. But what do you make of voids as tall as a 10-story building beneath the hill in the center of a French city? Hill of Saint-Nicaise, France. A Benedictine abbey from the 13th century. Beneath it lie conical halls carved into chalk rock. Some of them reach heights of 35 meters. That's the height of a 10-story building. Vertical shafts descend, interconnected by 4 kilometers of tunnels at a depth of 18 meters. The total network of galleries beneath the entire city of Reims spans over 57 kilometers. Stop. 57 kilometers of tunnels beneath one city. That's the distance from the center of Moscow to Vnukovo Airport, underground, beneath a medieval French city. Most of them are of monastic origin. Official explanation? The monks adapted the old Roman quarries for the storage of food and wine. Okay, then answer one question. Why did the Benedictines of the 13th century need voids of such volume? Wine requires a constant temperature, that's true, but rooms that are 35 meters high are excessive for any storage. The practical question is, how much wine can be stored in a hall that is 10 stories tall? The upper 9 stories of storage space are unnecessary. There's no need to build them. Maintaining them, ventilating them, and preventing the walls from collapsing incurs huge ongoing costs. Maintaining what you don't need is expensive, especially over the course of 5 centuries. If you just want to store wine, you build a cellar 3 to 4 meters deep. That's sufficient. 35 meters is a different engineering concept. Here's another corner. The chalky stone in which these halls are hewn is not stone in the usual sense. It is a soft material that can be cut by hand. This made construction relatively affordable, but the conical shapes, the width of the vertical shafts, the placement of the support columns, everything is calculated so that the structure can withstand the weight of several dozen meters of earth and stone above. Without this calculation, everything would have collapsed at the first flood or earthquake. In 8 centuries, nothing has collapsed. This is not luck, this is mathematics. Now remember the date, 1717. Peter I personally descended into these dungeons during his visit to France. Peter built fleets, dug canals, founded cities in swamps, and fought against Charles XII. It is not easy to astonish a man who did all of this with architecture. According to documentary accounts from those who accompanied him, he was struck by the scale of what he saw. What exactly did he see there? The official history does not address this question. The fact of the visit is recorded. The reaction is documented. What exactly amazed Peter in the monasterial cellars of Reims is not specified in the documents. Now for something different. During the years of World War I, when Reims found itself in the battle zone, schools operated in these underground tunnels. Hospitals, births were registered. On the walls, there are preserved graffiti by soldiers who lived there for months. Names, dates, short notes. Under bombardment, in the almost complete silence of 18 meters deep. Imagine this space in the 14th year. Above, artillery fire, burning neighborhoods, collapsing facades. Below, a teacher conducts a lesson by the light of kerosene lamps. Children sit on stools brought from home. In the next room, wounded on stretchers. Further still, a storeroom with supplies. And all this at a stable 12 degrees, which no one maintains deliberately. It is simply the temperature in these voids. It has always been like this. This means that the infrastructure was prepared for such a load. There was enough space. There was a proper division of areas, some zones for the sick, others for children, and others for soldiers. It was built with a margin, much larger than what was needed for wine. Peter the Great in 1717. The soldiers of World War I from 1914 to 1918. These dungeons served 2 completely different centuries in entirely different circumstances, each time for tasks unrelated to monasticism. Here's what is interesting about the case of Saint Nicolas. In 1914, when German troops shelled Homs, the entire city essentially relocated underground. Hundreds of civilians, hundreds of military personnel, several generations of students educated in underground classrooms, midwives delivering babies 18 meters beneath the city. This required not just a vast emptiness. Ventilation was necessary, otherwise several hundred people would suffocate in a matter of hours. Water supply was essential. Spaces suitable for various functions were needed. There had to be exits to the surface that wouldn't be blocked in the event of a collapse. All of this was there. Since the 13th century, long before anyone could have anticipated the use of these spaces for shelter in modern warfare. This is not an adaptation. This is original design with a buffer for loads that 13th century monks should not have anticipated if they were building just for wine. Today, in the monastic cellars of Saint-Nicaise, there are about 2 million bottles of Taittinger champagne stored. They rest there for 10 years, at a stable temperature of 10 to 12 degrees, which nobody actively maintains. It's simply the temperature in these cavities, all year round, always. The system, built by Benedictines in the 13th century for purposes that remain officially unexplained to us, now functions as an industrial refrigerator of planetary scale. And it works flawlessly. This is also information that the one who built this knew that it was being built to last. And here's one more detail worth adding. In 1689, the Abbey of Saint-Nicolas was destroyed during the French Revolution. The monks left. The monastery ceased to exist. But the cellars remained. They didn't go anywhere. They continued to exist. They maintained the same temperature, the same humidity, the same microclimate. In the 19th century, champagne merchants began to realize that these caverns were ideal for aging sparkling wines. Coincidence? No. Because the monks constructed them with a precise understanding of how they function. The monastery is gone. The function remains. This is the essence of what we are discussing. The monastic infrastructure outlived its creators. It was sufficiently sophisticated for subsequent generations to utilize it, for different purposes, in a different context, sometimes even unaware of who built it and why. Because the history of monasteries as strategic infrastructure did not end in the Middle Ages. It did not cease during the Enlightenment. It continued. And one of the starkest examples is located 40 kilometers from Vienna, on the banks of the Danube. Melk Abbey, Lower Austria, a Baroque monastery perched on a rock above the river, one of the most beautiful in Europe. Famous for its library with painted ceilings, a unique collection of manuscripts, and 18th century frescoes. Umberto Eco wrote The Name of the Rose, and it was this monastery that served as one of the inspirations for the mysterious abbey in the novel. Tourists ascend a long staircase from the river, enter the grand halls, and gaze up at the gilded vaults. In 1944, tunnel construction began in the Warburg Rock near this monastery. Project Quartz. Its objective is to relocate the production of the company Steyr-Daimler-Puch underground, away from the Allied air bombings. Production of bearings for tank and aviation engines. Strategic. Essential. Something that cannot be halted. By April 1945, the result? Over 7 kilometers of tunnels and nearly 8,000 square meters of production space deep beneath the rock. 7 kilometers of tunnels. In one rock. In 1 year. The price of these tunnels? 14,390 prisoners, detainees from the Mauthausen concentration camp branch. Almost 5,000 of them did not return. From this one place, in just 1 year. This is what was inside those tunnels. The production of ball bearings ranging from 20 to 180 millimeters in diameter. Accuracy down to hundredths of a millimeter. This required clean air, stable temperature, and complete insulation from vibration. The rock monolith provided all of this automatically. Outside, Allied aviation was destroying factories one by one. Here, silence and production. The front was retreating. The bearings continued to be machined. Now, a specific image that helps understand the scale. Outside, a monastery. Golden vaults, monks in robes, pilgrims on the stairs leading from the Danube. 300 meters from the entrance to the church, in the rock, thousands of people in striped robes have carved tunnels with centimeter precision. This is not just a proximity. It is the simultaneous existence of two worlds in one place. One is public. The other is deep beneath it. The post-war history of this place is a separate chapter. The tunnels were blown up in 1945. Documents were partially destroyed. The monastery returned to monastic life. In the guidebooks, there are mentions of the library, frescoes, and a view of the Danube. The first systematic excavations and surveys of the tunnels only began in 2003. 60 years passed before historians began to work with what had been done in the rock near the monastery. Why here, of all places? The Nazi project documentation explicitly states isolation and the already existing logistics base. The monastery mountain over the Danube was already a key point. There were already warehouses. There was already transportation access by river. There was already infrastructure accumulated over 8 centuries of the monastery's existence. The monks built it for their own needs. It was used by all who came afterward. The Birago barracks, which the Nazis used as the basis for camp infrastructure, were originally designed as part of a regional defense system, not as monastic buildings, but as fortifications. The monastery was built with an understanding of the military significance of its location, overlooking the river, perched on a cliff, with control over the shipping route. This is not an accusation against the Melka monks. It is important to understand. They did not build the factory or manage it, but they did construct a fortress at a strategic point, and that point remained strategic throughout all the changes of eras. Here's what is important to understand. Military engineers of the 20th century, seeking a suitable location for an underground factory, used the same criteria that monastery architects of the 12th century employed: isolation from random travelers, access to transportation routes, rocky ground suitable for tunneling, and existing infrastructure for storage and life support. Monasteries were built in strategic locations. This is not a coincidence. It is a choice. And in every century, whoever came to these points afterward, they came precisely because they were strategic. Monastes' robes were exchanged for military uniforms. Prayer was replaced by production. But the point remained the same. The monastery was built as a fortress. The fortress became a factory. This is a pattern, not an anomaly. Now look at it from a different perspective. The military engineers of the Third Reich, when selecting a site for underground production, conducted a systematic analysis of hundreds of locations. They were searching for a rock with the necessary parameters, and they chose one near a monastery. Not just any rock, the very one next to which a monastery had stood for 8 centuries. Why the monastery mountain and not any other rock in Lower Austria? Because the monastery mountain is already an inhabited, integrated logistical point. Roads lead to it already. There is housing nearby for workers, the monastery buildings. There are already warehouses. There is access to water. There is connectivity to transport routes along the Danube. This is not just a rock. It is an infrastructural hub that 8 centuries of monastic life have transformed into a ready base for any other use. The monastery fades away. The infrastructure remains. And the next one who arrives finds it and makes use of it. In the Middle Ages, it was the army of besiegers. In the 17th century, it was state prisoners. In the 20th, a military factory. The point remains strategic regardless of who occupies it. And now, the final object. It is fundamentally different from all the previous ones. For everything we have considered, there is an explanation, albeit uncomfortable, contradicting the official version, but an explanation nonetheless. For the last one, there is none. At all. Bavaria, Upper Austria. About 700 documented sites just in Bavaria. The local name is Erdstall. What is this? Extremely narrow tunnels, height from 1 to 1.5 meters, width 60 centimeters. In such a space, an adult cannot stand, cannot turn around, cannot carry a load. Dating back to the 10th to 13th centuries, almost all of them are located directly beneath the foundations of churches and monastery courtyards. A characteristic feature is the schlafs, vertical or horizontal openings, passes, through which one must squeeze through with difficulty. Passing through them is an effort. Not an entrance, but a squeeze. And, most importantly, in 95% of the excavated earthworks, absolutely nothing has been found. No soot from torches, no trash, no bones, no tools, no food remains, no traces of daily life. Sterile tunnels beneath sacred buildings. Let's examine this through a basic principle. People always leave traces, everywhere and at all times. Bones, ashes, shards, seeds, footprints, embers from a hearth. This is not a theory, it's the foundation of archaeology. If people lived or worked somewhere, they leave traces, even during the briefest visits, even in the cleanest conditions. In the Erdstalls, nothing. Sterile. It's not just few traces, it's their complete absence. This excludes shelters. People in shelters leave traces of their stay. It excludes warehouses. Traces of the stored items remain in warehouses. It excludes workshops, tools and shavings. It excludes tombs, bones. In 2011, a cow fell into a hole in Bavaria. She was just walking through the pasture and fell in. The farmer clearly did not immediately understand what had happened. The cow had vanished into the ground. He approaches closer. A hole gapes beneath the grass. He takes a flashlight and crawls down, and finds himself in a tunnel. Neat, dry, with characteristic horizontal constrictions, called schlafs. Beneath the peaceful farm, which 800 years ago was a church property, lay an entire network, perfectly preserved, undescribed by anyone, unmapped on any historical plan. Inside, absolute emptiness, no signs of human presence. Officially, historians propose 3 versions: shelters, storages, symbolic tombs for restless souls. But none of these versions explains the sterility. Shelters leave traces. Storages leave traces. Tombs leave bones. Here, nothing. There is another fact, an acoustic one. The shape of the schlafs, these vertical passages, creates specific sound resonances. This is documented in acoustic studies. When passing through a schlaf, certain frequencies are generated, a specific effect on human auditory perception. Why is this important? Because the random shape of a stone opening does not create a consistent acoustic effect. This is the result of deliberately giving the opening a specific shape. Why is this necessary in a tunnel where one cannot stand upright, where there is no air to breathe, and from which there is nothing to carry out? And lastly, what cannot be explained by coincidence? Erdstalls almost always begin in a sacred zone, beneath the altar of the church, under the crypt, not somewhere off to the side, not in outbuildings, in the most sacred place of the complex. This is not an interpretation, it is a topographic fact documented for hundreds of objects. Science has been faced with this question for over 100 years. Not a contentious answer, where different schools offer different versions, but the absence of an answer. There is no consensus. There is no explanation. 700 objects, and not a single convincing version of why they were built. There is another fact that almost never makes it into publications. The construction of the earthworks required serious effort. It is not just a pit in the ground. These are precisely carved tunnels in rock or dense soil with intentionally designed architectural elements. The schlaps are not random narrowings. They repeat from object to object with identical geometry throughout Bavaria, in sites separated by tens of kilometers, built by different people at different times. Identical geometry, in 7 independent objects. This means there was a tradition. There was knowledge about what exactly to build and what form it should take. This knowledge was passed down, through generations, across distances. Yet at the same time, without a single documentary evidence of why and for what purpose. A network of 700 objects beneath the churches, with deliberately preserved geometry, in complete sterility, without explanations. This is what adds scale. 700 is just the documented objects in Bavaria and Upper Austria. In 2012, the research group Arbeitsgruppe Erdstahl, which has been studying these objects since the 70s, counted over 2,000 similar structures throughout Europe. Similar structures have been found in Ireland, Scotland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Everywhere, beneath medieval churches. Everywhere, the same geometry of schlaps. Everywhere, sterility. What appears as a local peculiarity in Bavaria, on the scale of all Europe, looks like a continental tradition. A tradition that no one has described, that no one has explained, that has not been mentioned even once in official chronicles. For centuries, something has been built under the churches, and no one deemed it necessary to write down why. Reflect on this separately. Medieval chroniclers recorded everything: the construction of bridges, droughts, the births and deaths of noble people, the arrival of ambassadors, outbreaks of diseases, 2 millennia of objects beneath their feet, and not a word. Either it was so obvious and well known that it didn't require recording, or it was so secretive that documentation was forbidden. Both scenarios are equally alarming. And here's what is important to say about this last object. It doesn't matter what exactly the Erdstalls are. What matters is this. Their existence beneath churches and monasteries indicates that the people who built these sacred spaces laid something underneath them. Something for which they left no traces. Something that they did not tell to their descendants. Something that required a very specific acoustics. This is, in itself, information about how sacred space functioned in the Middle Ages. But there is one more observation to make right here, at the end, after the 7 objects. Each of the previous 6 has a specific identified function: storage, fleet, hydraulics, laboratory, shelter, factory. The Erdstahls do not have one. They are structures without a known function. However, the fact that we do not know the function does not mean it did not exist. It only means that we do not yet know what to call it. Of the 7 objects, 6 provided us with uncomfortable yet specific answers. 1 only posed a question. This relationship in itself says something about the monastic infrastructure. We can already discern much of it, but not all. So, 7 objects, 7 countries, 7 centuries, 7 faiths, and 1 pattern. Lavra. 300 kilograms of gold in a randomly discovered cache. A cave system with chambers that don't appear on any official map. And the treasure of the Varangian cave, which has yet to be found. Solovki. An Arctic fortress with a fleet of 36 vessels, a salt monopoly over the entire north, and 8 years under siege by the state army. Mulbron. 20 artificial lakes, 2 redirected riverbeds, sewage systems 500 years ahead of London. Escorial. 3 underground zones of pharmaceutical production under the direct control of the Spanish king. 100 species of plants from the New World. Tunnels with separated information flows. Saint Niket. 57 kilometers of chalk galleries beneath Rheims. Halls as high as a 10-story building. 800 years without a single crack. Milk. Nazi military engineers came to this rock above the Danube because the monks had already turned it into a ready-made strategic base over 8 centuries. Erdstahl. 700 tunnels, all under churches, all sterile. No explanations whatsoever. At first glance, each case has a local justification. Gold was hidden by everyone who could. The fleet was a climatic necessity. The canals were simply the work of clever monks. The pharmacy represented medieval medicine, and so on. But this explains only one case. When the same result is reproduced 7 times, in Kiev, in the Arctic, in Baden-Württemberg, in Castile, in Champagne, in Lower Austria, in Bavaria, the explanation of "it just happened that way" stops being valid. Plot these points on the map. Lavra, control over trade routes through Kiev. Solovki, the only supplier of salt in the entire north. Mulbron, the hydraulic hub of the region. Escorial, the pharmaceutical monopoly of the empire. Ra, the site of the coronation of French kings. Melk, control over navigation on the Danube. These are not random places. Each one is a crucial point. Control over the resource, a position without which the territory cannot function. And at each of these points, a monastery, with underground chambers, with infrastructure that makes the structure invulnerable, autonomous, and functionally self-sufficient for centuries to come. Monastic attire offered a practical advantage that you won't find in tourist brochures: freedom from any external oversight. There were no officials coming in. Taxes weren't paid. Underground works weren't coordinated. No one had the right to ask what was being built under the monastery courtyard and why. It was the perfect legal perimeter for a structure whose function need not be explained to outsiders. I don't claim to know who built this and for what purpose. It could be the order networks that spread engineering knowledge along with their statutes. It could be states that deliberately used religious forms as a cover. It could be something else entirely, something that doesn't yet have a name. I am simply asking a question that the official descriptions of these objects never pose. All the facts we discussed are publicly available. Paters, UNESCO reports, Nazi project documentation, Soviet anti-religious pamphlets, materials from acoustic studies of Bavarian tunnels. Everything is public. It is simply categorized into separate niches. The Lavra, in church history, Solovki, in the history of the Russian North, Mobron, in architecture catalogs, Melk, in travel guides. No one looks at all of this at the same time. Perhaps that's why the question has still not been asked. Beneath every monastery lies its own story. It's just that this is often not included in the tour itinerary.